The DNA test said my son wasn't mine. I thought that was the worst news I'd ever hear. Then the lab technician looked at the results, frowned, and quietly said, "Sir, yours wasn't either." The room went silent. I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. But when she turned the report around and pointed to one line, everything I thought I knew about my family began to fall apart. The line was a genetic marker. Rare, she said. The kind of thing that shows up once in roughly 200,000 profiles. In 11 years at that lab, she had seen it twice, and now she was looking at it twice more in the same afternoon, in 2 samples that had arrived in the same envelope. My son carried it. I carried it. That alone would have been a curiosity. What turned it into the frown was the redundant check. When I ordered the test, I had signed a records release without reading every line of it, the way you do, and because the lab was affiliated with the hospital network, their system had pulled my existing genetic profile for verification. I had one on file. In 2019, 2 years after my father died of a heart attack at 66, a cardiologist had run a hereditary panel on me to see what I was carrying around. It came back clean. He told me I hadn't inherited my father's heart, and I remember walking out of that appointment feeling like a man who had been handed a pardon. For 7 years, I thought I was lucky. The profile from that panel did not match the cheek swab I had given the week before. She kept her voice low, like she was apologizing for the math itself. There were 2 possibilities, she said. Either the hospital had made a labeling error in 2019, which happens but almost never survives the double verification step, or the sample sitting in my medical record was never mine to begin with. She slid the second envelope across the desk to sit beside the first, and the 2 of them lay there like a pair of headlights coming at me in the wrong lane. I asked her what I was supposed to do with that. It was not really a question for a lab technician. She knew it, and I knew it, and she answered it anyway, with more kindness than the building was designed for. She said I should probably talk to my family. I signed something on a clipboard. I don't remember what. On the way out, I passed a man in the waiting room holding a sleeping toddler against his shoulder, filling out a form one-handed, and I remember thinking, with a strange clinical distance, that he had no idea what paper could do to a person. The automatic doors let me out into a gray afternoon, and I stood in the parking lot for a moment trying to remember where I'd left my truck, in a lot that held maybe 30 cars. A month earlier, none of this existed. What existed was a 7-year-old who snored like a lawnmower and had collected 3 strep infections between November and February, each one arriving the week after the last antibiotic ran out. The pediatrician finally sent us to an ENT, who looked in his throat for about 4 seconds and said the tonsils were coming out. Routine, he said. 20 minutes. Popsicles after. The pre-op blood work happened on a Tuesday morning. My wife had a staff meeting at the school library, so it was me in the little chair next to the exam table, watching my son grip a stuffed orca he had owned since he was 2 days old, while a nurse with cold hands found his vein on the first try. He didn't cry. He told her she was better at it than the last lady, which is the kind of thing he says, and she laughed and read his chart out loud while she labeled the vials, the way nurses narrate to keep kids calm. Blood type B positive, she said, to nobody. I am O negative. I know this the way I know my own address, because I have been giving blood every 8 weeks since I was 19. There is a laminated donor card in my wallet behind my license. 41 lifetime donations. Universal donor, they always say, like it's a small superpower. My wife is O positive. I knew that from the hospital paperwork I had read and reread during the worst nights of our marriage, years before our son existed, when knowing her blood type was one of the only useful things I could do. I did not say a word in that room. I smiled. I signed the consent forms where the nurse pointed. I told my son that after the surgery he could order a milkshake the size of his head, and he negotiated me up to a milkshake and a comic book, and I shook his hand like we were closing a deal. But I remembered enough high school biology to know that 2 type O parents do not make a B positive child. It is not unlikely. It is not rare. Under the ordinary rules of how blood gets handed down, it is impossible. The thought did not arrive like a lightning bolt. It arrived like a stone dropped into a well, and the well was deeper than I expected, and I spent the whole drive home waiting to hear it hit the bottom, while my son sang along to the radio in the back seat, getting most of the words wrong. That night, I waited until the house was asleep and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad. I drew Punnett squares like a 15-year-old studying for a quiz. O crossed with O, 4 boxes, all of them O. I drew it 3 times as if the grid might come out different on the 3rd pass. Then I spent 2 hours reading about the exceptions, because I am the kind of man who reads about the exceptions. There is something called the Bombay phenotype, where a person's blood masks its own type, and there are chimeras, people who carry 2 genetic lines in one body, and there are typing errors at labs. I wrote the odds of each one in the margin of the legal pad. I price commercial roofs for a living. I have spent 20 years learning the difference between unlikely and impossible, and learning that the people who confuse the two are the ones who end up paying for it. A typing error was the most likely explanation. A typing error was what I told myself I was ruling out. I did not buy one of the novelty kits where you spit in a tube and they tell you you're 4% Viking. I found a clinical lab 2 towns over that did legal-grade paternity testing with documented chain of custody, the kind whose results hold up in a courtroom, and I paid $389 plus a rush fee, and I signed their records release at 11 o'clock at night with the porch light off so the neighbors wouldn't see the kitchen lit up and wonder. I told myself the chain of custody was about accuracy. Looking back, some part of me was already preparing a file. The kit came in a plain box 2 days later. The swab itself took 4 seconds. We were brushing our teeth, my son and I, side by side the way we do. And I gagged on my toothbrush, reaching a back molar, and he laughed so hard he had to spit early. And while he was wiping his chin, I said, "Open up, one more thing," and ran the swab inside his cheek and told him it was for the surgery. He said, "Okay." He trusts me the way you trust gravity. I sealed both vials at the counter at 11:05, signed the chain of custody labels with the pen we keep in the junk drawer, and stood there for a long minute feeling like a man who had just stolen something from his own house. The lab quoted 5 to 7 business days. They were the longest 7 days of my life, and I include the week my father spent in the cardiac ICU. I went to work. I climbed a warehouse roof in the rain and measured membrane seams and wrote up a bid like a functioning person. And at home, I did the thing I am the least proud of in this entire story. I watched my wife, 14 years. I met her at the county library reference desk, where I had come to dig through zoning archives for a job, and she found the right binder in 90 seconds, and then explained, unprompted, why the filing system was idiotic. We got married at the courthouse on a Tuesday because the fee was $40, and threw a party in her sister's backyard with a rented griddle. I have watched that face across every kind of table: kitchen, hospital, funeral home. I know what it looks like when she is hiding a Christmas present. I know what it looks like when she is about to cry in public and is deciding not to. So I watched her that week the way you would case a stranger. I checked whether her phone faced down. I noted when she took calls in the other room. Our anniversary fell inside that window, the 14th one, and I bought tulips on the way home like a man buying an alibi, and she put them in the blue pitcher and teared up a little, the way she does every year, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. I found exactly nothing, because there was nothing to find, and I lay next to her at night hating the part of me that kept looking anyway. On the 6th day, the lab called. Not an email with a portal link, which is what their paperwork said to expect. A phone call from a human being asking if I could come in person. There was an anomaly in the results, she said, that they would rather walk me through than send. Labs do not ask you to come in person to tell you everything is fine. I took a half day. I told the office I had a dentist appointment. I checked in at 2:15 and sat under a television playing a cooking show with the sound off, and at 2:40 a technician with kind eyes and a folder called me back to a small room with 2 chairs, and she sat down across from me and opened the folder. You already know what she said. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 20 minutes before I did anything. The 2 envelopes lay on the passenger seat. The radio was off. Somewhere behind the building, a delivery driver was backing up, and the beeping went on and on like a heart monitor, and I just sat there with my hands at 10 and 2 on a parked steering wheel. Then I called my mother. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which meant she would be home from her shift at the church food pantry, doing the crossword in the chair by the window. She is 73. She answered on the second ring, happy, asking about her grandson's throat. I let her tell me about the pantry's canned goods shortage for a minute, because I could not figure out how to start. Then I asked her one question. I kept my voice as level as I could. Mom, is there anything about how I was born that you never told me? The silence went on so long I pulled the phone away from my ear to see if the call had dropped. The timer was still counting. When her voice came back, it belonged to a much older woman. It came out slowly, in pieces, the way a thing comes out when it has been packed away for 45 years. She and my father had tried for 6 years. 6 years of nothing, of doctors with no answers, of watching everyone at church get pregnant by accident. Then a deacon's wife, quietly after a potluck, gave her the name of a specialist 2 towns over, a fertility practice, 1981. The doctor there examined them both and then sat them down in his office and offered something he called donor assistance. The donor would be an anonymous medical student, he told them, screened, healthy, intelligent, completely confidential. No one would ever need to know, including the child. It cost $1,200. My father picked up second shifts at the machine shop for an entire winter to cover it without touching the savings, so there would be nothing to explain. They told no one. Not my grandparents, not their pastor, not me. She said my father forbade her from ever speaking about it, even to him. She tried once, when I was about 10, to say something about how blessed they were, and he set down his fork and left the table, and that was the last time it was mentioned in that house. He carried it to his grave in 2014, and she had planned, in her quiet way, to do the same. We wanted you so much, she said, that we didn't ask questions. She was crying by then, apologizing to me across 45 years, and I found myself doing the thing I apparently do, which is comforting the person who has just rearranged my entire life. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. I meant it, mostly. Then I told her there was more, but not today, and I hung up and sat there while the delivery truck finally stopped beeping. I thought about the cardiologist in 2019, telling me I hadn't inherited my father's heart, and me feeling lucky. Of course I hadn't. My wife was at the kitchen table when I got home at 6:40, running summer reading lists through the little laminator she bought with her own money because the school wouldn't. The whole kitchen smelled like warm plastic. Our son was at her mother's for the night, which I had arranged 2 days earlier, telling her I wanted to take her to dinner. Another small lie of logistics. I had become fluent in them. I did not take her to dinner. I set both envelopes on the table in front of her, on top of a half-laminated list of chapter books, and I sat down across from her and said, I need you to read these, and then I need you to talk to me. She read the paternity result first. I watched the color leave her face face in real time, from the forehead down, like someone had opened a valve. She read it twice. Then she looked up at me and said the thing I had spent 6 days bracing for, except she said it in a voice I had not braced for. Not defensive, not rehearsed, just bewildered, almost childlike. I have never, not once, not in 14 years. You know that. Tell me you know that. Here is what I knew. I knew what her face looks like when she lies, because in 14 years I have caught her lying exactly twice, both times about money she spent on me. I knew what guilt looks like on her, and I knew what fear looks like, and what I was looking at was neither. Her hands were shaking so badly the envelope rattled, and the tears that came were not the tears of a person who has been caught. They were the tears of a person whose floor has just vanished. There is a difference. You cannot fake the difference. I had spent 6 days watching her like a stranger, and in the moment it mattered, every one of those 14 years stood up at once and testified. I said, I know, and I meant it all the way through. Then I slid the second envelope across, the one about me, and watched her read it, and watched her arrive, white-faced, at the same closed door I had been standing in front of all afternoon. Neither of us said anything for a long minute. The laminator hummed, and then she said it first, the thing that was sitting in the middle of the table between us, bigger than both envelopes. The clinic, she said. Oh my God, the clinic. You have to understand what the clinic was to us before it became what it is now. We lost 3 pregnancies before our son. The first was in 2015 at 9 weeks. We went in for a routine ultrasound, joking in the waiting room about names we would never use, and then the technician went quiet in that specific way and said she was going to get the doctor and left us alone in a dim room with the image still frozen on the screen. The second was 2016 at 6 weeks, over almost before we had let ourselves believe in it. The third was the one that nearly broke us, 2017, 11 weeks. That one had a heartbeat. We had heard it twice, this fast little galloping thing, and my wife had started sleeping with her hand flat on her stomach, and then one morning there was blood, and by that night there wasn't a heartbeat anymore, and I learned that there is a particular silence a house makes that I would not wish on anyone alive. Her doctor referred us to a fertility practice 2 towns over, the biggest one in the region. Decades of results, she said. The waiting room was beige and soothing on purpose, with a saltwater fish tank and a fake orchid and a wall of baby photos sent in by grateful families, hundreds of them, a whole weather system of other people's luck. In the lobby hung an oil portrait of the founder, silver-haired, half-smiling, the little sapling crest of the practice on a brass plate underneath, with the year 1976. We never met him. He was long retired by then. We saw a younger associate, a perfectly nice man with cold instruments and warm hands, who told us our odds and percentages I wrote down in a notebook. We did the injections at 9 o'clock every night, with a timer on my phone, me drawing up the dose and her looking at the ceiling and counting backwards from 5 in German, which she does not speak because it made us laugh the first night and then became law. The Sharps container lived on the dresser next to the wedding photo. The retrieval got 11 eggs. I remember the embryologist calling the morning after the thaw of my sample with an update, saying the morning had gone a little sideways but that we were on track. And I remember being so flooded with relief at on track that I never once asked what sideways meant. You don't interrogate good news. Not in year 3 of trying. You hold your breath and you say thank you. The transfer took 9 minutes. 10 days later, there were 2 lines. 8 months after that, in December, a nurse put 6 pounds 1 ounce on my bare chest, and I stopped being a man who priced roofs and became, as far as I was concerned, a father, and nothing in the building said otherwise. The folder was in the filing cabinet in the den, behind the 2018 taxes, where it had been sleeping for 8 years. I pulled it that same night, after the laminator was cold and my wife was sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the dishwasher, which is where she goes. Consent forms, billing statements. The cycle came to $14,217.40, none of it covered. Every dollar of it itemized in a font that now looked like it was mocking me. A glossy brochure with a stock photo of a sleeping newborn in a knit hat. An appointment card with a time written in somebody's looping hand. 8 years of dust, and inside it, the whole architecture of how our son came to exist. While I was spreading it across the table, my phone started buzzing. My mother, who I had told only that I needed to see whatever paperwork still existed, was in her closet with a shoebox, photographing documents one at a time and texting them to me. Each photo slightly crooked, each one preceded by a typed sorry. The 1981 intake form arrived at 11:52 p.m. She had kept it pressed flat for 45 years under the family Bible, which is the most her thing I can possibly tell you. The carbon copy of the check arrived at 11:58, $1,200 in my father's blunt machinist handwriting, the signature of a man working a winter of second shifts to pay for a secret. The intake form had a letterhead, a little sapling crest. I stood up and went and got our 2018 packet and held the 2 pages side by side under the kitchen light. The same crest, the same practice name. 37 years apart, the logo hadn't been so much as refreshed. And at the back of our packet, stapled behind the consent forms, was a photocopied page I had never read, titled Statement of Laboratory Standards, dated 1991, signed by the founder in his capacity as medical director emeritus. A photocopy of a photocopy, his signature gone slightly furry with reproduction, still being stapled into patient packets in 2018 like a saint's relic. The same signature was on my mother's intake form, crisp, Original, 1981, same clinic, same founding doctor. My wife had come to stand in the doorway. It was almost 1 a.m. She looked at the 2 documents lying side by side on our kitchen table, 2 generations of the same letterhead, and she said very quietly, "What are the odds?" And I heard myself answer in my work voice, the flat one I use on contractors who are hiding something. I don't believe in odds like these. Here is the thing about my job, and I promise it matters. I estimate commercial roofing. For 20 years, my entire professional life has been climbing onto surfaces that look fine and finding out what is actually underneath. Every roof looks fine from the street. The job is the core sample. The job is assuming rot until the numbers prove otherwise, documenting everything, because the moment a dispute starts, the man with the dated photographs wins, and the man with the strong feelings loses. So I did not rage. I did not call the clinic and scream at whoever answered. I did not post in any of the forums I was about to spend my nights reading. What I did was go to the office supply store and buy a banker's box, a spiral notebook, and a date stamp. 2 copies of every page. 1 set in the box, 1 set scanned into a folder on my laptop that I named House Records, because a man's desktop is visible to anyone walking past with a coffee. The spiral notebook became a log. Every date, every call, every name, every document, written down the same day in pen. I went back through my phone and reconstructed the timeline of 2018. The appointment confirmation still in my email. The embryologist's a little sideways call sitting right there in my call history. 8:47 a.m., 4 minutes long. I printed the phone record. I date stamped it. At night, after they were asleep, I read. I learned that what I was looking at had a name, fertility fraud, and that the name was newer than the crime. I read about doctors in other states, unmasked decades later by mail-order ancestry kits, with 30 children, 60 children, 90. I read that in our state, deceiving a patient about the source of genetic material did not become a specific crime until 2021, and that the law does not reach backward. Whatever had been done to my mother in 1981, and whatever had been done to us in 2018, the criminal code had been built too late to touch it, which left one road. I made a list of 3 attorneys who had handled cases like this. I called all 3 on my lunch breaks, sitting in my truck in the supply yard with the windows up, and the second one listened to my whole opening without interrupting, and then asked me exactly one question. "Do you still have the original documents?" I looked at the banker's box belted into my passenger seat like a child. I said, "You have no idea." Her office was on the 2nd floor above a credit union, with a window unit working hard and a framed photo of her kayaking somewhere green. No marble, no mahogany. I like that. Marble means your fee is paying for marble. I talked for 11 minutes before she said a single word. I know it was 11 minutes because I am who I am, and I had my notebook open on my knee. She let me lay it all out. The blood draw, the Punnett squares, the 2 envelopes, my mother's confession, the matching letterhead 37 years apart, and she took notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting I could not have read with a court order. And when I finally stopped, she set down her pen and said, "You're the third." The third family, she meant, to sit in that chair and describe that practice. The first case had settled years ago, sealed, before anyone understood the scale. The second was ongoing. She could not tell me details of either, and the fact that she would not even, when it would have helped her sign me, told me I had the right lawyer. Then she gave me an education. What happened to my mother in 1981 and what happened to my wife and me in 2018 lives in the civil law as several things at once: fraud, medical battery, failure of informed consent. The statute of limitations sounds fatal until you learn about the discovery rule. The clock does not start when the wrong is done to you. It starts when you reasonably could have discovered it. My clock, she said, tapping the lab envelopes, started in that little room with the kind-eyed technician. 45 years of concealment had bought the clinic nothing. Her plan was paper. A litigation hold letter would go out that same week, putting the practice on legal notice that destroying so much as a sticky note would now be its own catastrophe. Then a subpoena duces tecum, donor logs, cryopreservation inventory, chain of custody records, lab manuals, every revision, going back to the founding. She wanted the boring documents, she said, because fraud lives in the boring documents. I signed a retainer and wrote a check for $5,000, which is a strange thing to hand a stranger above a credit union, and she shook my hand at the door and gave me the only warning of the entire process that turned out to be understated. "These cases get worse before they get better," she said. "The records are going to tell you things you can't untell yourself. Make sure your marriage is holding hands when the boxes arrive." The boxes took 4 months to arrive. The practice's lawyers fought the subpoena in increments, the way you fight when the documents are worse than the fighting looks, and lost in increments. While the lawyers fought, the rest of us lived in the in-between, which nobody warns you about. My wife alphabetized the spice rack at midnight. I caught her at it twice. Pajamas, reading glasses, every jar out on the counter at 12:40 in the morning. Cumin before coriander, because it was the one corner of the world that would hold still and be ordered. I reshingled the shed. The shed did not need it. I stripped it to the deck anyway and rebuilt it over 3 weekends, because 8 feet up with a nail gun is the only place my head goes quiet. Our son lost a tooth, hit his first coach pitch double, and asked for a dog with a lawyer's persistence. He knew nothing. We had decided that together, early, sitting on the bedroom floor like teenagers, he would hear it from us, at his level, when it was confirmed and final, and not one day before. Until then, his entire job was to be 7. 7. Watching him be 7 that summer was the only part of my life that didn't have a date stamp on it. Sunday afternoons, I drove to my mother's. Her guilt operated on its own schedule, arriving in waves and voicemails that all began with me again, honey. One Sunday, I came in and found the shoebox out on her kitchen table, its entire contents laid in rows, every receipt pressed flat from 45 years under the Bible, the check carbon squared to the table edge like a place setting. She had been sitting with it. She told me a thing I wrote in the notebook that night with the date next to it, that after I was born, she had wanted to send the doctor a thank you card, a photograph of me, something. My father wouldn't allow it. We paid, he said, and that's the end of it, and he never said the man's name again in his life. My father, who could not have told you what intuition was, standing in 1982 with his arms crossed in front of a door he never let anyone open. I think about that more than almost anything else in the story. I did not tell her about the marker, or the second envelope, or where the trail was so obviously pointing. She is 73. There would be a right time, and it would come after proof, not before. The withholding was its own kind of weight, and I carried it the way my father apparently carried his, silently, at the dinner table, fork by fork. The records arrived on a Thursday. 14 banker's boxes, 4 decades of a fertility practice, wheeled into a conference room that smelled like toner. The attorney had a paralegal and a document service, but I took a personal day and asked to help index, and she looked at me for a second and said, honestly, you're better at it than the service. It was the only compliment of the entire case, and I have kept it. The donor catalog came out of Box 3. 11 donor codes, active from 1979 to 2009, each with a typed biography. Donor 4, medical student, 6 feet, blue eyes. Donor 7, engineering graduate, athletic, brown eyes. Donor 9, seminary student. The biographies rotated details like a man shuffling 3 shells. The heights varied, the eye colors traded places, the occupations changed with what the era found trustworthy. In 1981, you sold a medical student. By the 90s, an engineer. The cryopreservation inventory was in Box 6, and Box 6 was where the floor went. Every straw in the freezer had a batch series stamped at intake, and the paralegal was the one who first noticed that the batch series under 11 different donor codes ran in one unbroken sequence, one source, 11 names for one man. The attorney's expert would later put it formally, a single contributor consistent across all catalog identities, but it didn't need the formality. It was right there in the intake stamps, in order, like the world's most patient confession. 217 patient files got flagged. Some were donor assistance sales, like my mother's, where the lie was the biography, but 41 of them were something else. 41 files where couples using their own material had a sample fail. At thaw, at collection, at processing, and the lab proceeded anyway, with house inventory, and recorded it. Our file was in Box 9, the embryology log from 2018, the morning of fertilization. A handwritten annotation, neat as a pharmacist's, sample compromised at thaw, proceeded with inventory straw D11 per standing protocol. Disclosure deferred, initials, a time, 8:31 a.m. My phone record, the one I had date stamped months earlier, shows the embryologist calling me at 8:47, a little sideways but on track. 16 minutes after someone wrote disclosure deferred about my son. The standing protocol was in Box 11. In the laboratory manual, original 1984, revised 1991, never rescinded. In the event of sample failure, the laboratory shall proceed with house inventory to preserve cycle viability. Disclosure at physician discretion. Physician discretion. I read the page 4 times. The founder had retired in 2009. He had walked out of that building 11 years before my son was conceived in it, and it didn't matter because he had written himself into the machinery. The protocol outlived the man's tenure, the way a furnace outlives the man who installed it. They were still stapling his statement of laboratory standards into patient packets. They were still pulling his straws as backup. The fraud had stopped being a person and become a procedure. The attorney came and stood next to me while I read it the 4th time, and she said quietly, now you know what I meant. 14 months in, I sat in a deposition and looked at the founder for the first time outside of an oil painting. He was 81. He came in a pressed navy blazer with a hearing aid in his left ear and sat with his spotted hands folded on the table, wedding band still on. And the first thing I understood, watching him settle into the chair, was that he was not nervous. His counsel sat beside him with a banker's box of his own. A court reporter took her place at the end of the table, and the named plaintiffs were permitted along one wall, and I was one of them, with my notebook on my knee. For the first hour, he was unfailingly courteous and remembered almost nothing. Then the questions reached the catalog, and something in him decided that being misunderstood was worse than being liable, and he began, against the visible advice of his own lawyer, to explain. Standards were different, he said. Anonymity protected everyone, the families, the donors, the children most of all. Screening in those years was rudimentary. He could not vouch for a stranger's history, but he could vouch for his own. He used the word vouch. He described the substitutions the way a man describes crop rotation. And when the attorney asked him flatly whether the couples had consented to receive his genetic material, he looked at her with what I can only describe as disappointment and said, those couples came to me empty-handed and left with children. I never took a single thing from anyone in that building. I gave. She slid the 1984 manual page across the table, the standing protocol, the physician discretion. He put on his reading glasses. He read it for a long moment. I don't don't recall drafting that language, he said, which was the first sentence all morning his lawyer looked happy about. Near the end, she asked him whether he understood why the people along the wall were in the room. He turned his head and looked down the line of us, taking his time, face by face, and there was something in the sweep of it that made my skin move, and he said, I look at this table and I see my children. They should be grateful they exist. The court reporter's hands kept moving. I wrote the time in my notebook, 10:47 a.m., because writing the time was the only thing I could do with my hands that was legal. The attorney laid her palm flat on the table, the way you would on a flank of an animal you were calming, and called for a recess. At the water fountain in the hallway, he passed within 3 feet of me. I studied the pattern of the carpet until he was gone. There was nothing in that face I wanted to find, and one thing I was terrified I would. The match itself, the thing that turns an inference into a fact, could not come from my banker's box. It had to come from neutral ground. As part of the consolidated case, the court had established a monitored DNA registry run by an independent laboratory. No party's thumb on it. The founder's reference profile was already in it, compelled during the earlier litigation. What the registry did was simple and merciless. You submitted a monitored sample, and it told you whether you belonged to him. The collections were nothing like a kit from a box. A monitored draw at a contracted facility, 2 witnesses, barcodes scanned aloud, signatures at every handoff. I went on a Monday morning. My son went that Thursday afternoon at his pediatrician's office, where it had been arranged so it would feel like any other appointment. The swab took 4 seconds. The same 4 seconds mine had taken at our bathroom sink a lifetime earlier, and he picked a dinosaur sticker on the way out and complained that they were out of the good ones. He thought it was part of his post-surgery follow-up. The deferral of disclosure, it turns out, is a skill you inherit from the people who did it to you, and I hated how naturally it came. 3 weeks, the coordinator said. I can tell you everything about those 3 weeks and nothing useful. I won a bid on a distribution center, the biggest of my year, and felt nothing on the drive home. I sat in the school pickup line at 2:51 every day watching for one specific backpack in a river of identical backpacks. My wife and I didn't talk about it after the first week. We had simply run out of arrangements of the same 6 sentences. But twice I woke at 3 in the morning and her hand had found mine in the dark, already holding on, both of us pretending to be asleep. And that was the entire conversation, and it was sufficient. On a Tuesday at 4:12 p.m., I was sitting in my truck outside the supply yard with the engine off, writing up a materials list on a clipboard when the phone rang with the registry's number on the screen. The coordinator had a kind, procedural voice, the voice of a woman who makes this exact call for a living and has never once enjoyed it. Are you somewhere you can sit down? She said. I looked at the steering wheel. I said yes. She read it in registry language first, the way they are trained to, the wording stripped of every soft place to land. The monitored sample submitted under my name had been compared against the court's reference profile. Paternal match. Confirmed to a statistical certainty she recited to several decimal places. Then the second finding. The monitored sample submitted under my son's name, compared against the same reference profile. Paternal match. Confirmed. The same reference profile. She said it twice because it was her job to make sure I understood, and then she stopped talking and let the line be quiet, because it was also her job to know when to do that. The man who fathered me fathered my son. I sat in my truck with the clipboard still in my lap, the materials list half finished, fasteners, membrane, drip edge, my handwriting stopping mid-word, and I watched a forklift move rebar across the yard like the world had any business continuing. My boy is not mine. He is my half-brother. My wife never lied to me. Not once. Not in 14 years. My mother never knew what she was carrying out of that office in 1981. 2 generations of one family, manufactured in the same building, by the same man, 40 years apart. Once as a product he sold, once as an inventory item his protocol pulled off a shelf 16 minutes before someone called me with good news. Disclosure deferred. Disclosure deferred for 45 years in one file and 8 years in the other, and both deferrals ended in the same week, in the same truck, in a supply yard, with a clipboard. I don't remember the drive home. I remember the radio was off because I remember the silence having a texture. I pulled into the driveway, and my wife was already standing on the porch. She told me later she had been checking the window since 3:30, and I did not have to say a single word. She watched me get out of the truck, and she knew it all from the way I closed the door, and she came down the steps and met me on the walk, and we stood there in front of the whole neighborhood, 2 Type O parents, holding on to each other like the house was on fire behind us. We told him on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks later, once the words had been chosen. We had one telehealth session with a child psychologist to choose them. A Tuesday evening, $180, 45 minutes. And she gave us the frame we used and one rule we kept. Answer what is asked, at the size it is asked, and not one size bigger. Pancakes first, because Saturday has laws. Then the living room floor, the 3 of us, where the big conversations of his life had all happened so far. Most of them about dogs. We kept it simple, the way you keep load-bearing things simple. Before he was born, we told him, a helper at the hospital where he was made did something wrong with the medicine, and because of that mistake, the tiny piece that helps make a baby came from a different man than Daddy. Nothing about him was a mistake. The mistake was the helpers. Everything that happened after, every day of his entire life, happened exactly the way it was supposed to. He listened the way he listens to instructions for a game, looking at the carpet, working a loose thread out of it with 2 fingers. He asked if the helper got in trouble, and I said a lot of people were working on exactly that. which is true. He asked if he was still related to Grandma, and my wife said yes, completely, forever. And he nodded like a man checking off a list. Then he stopped pulling the thread and looked up at me and asked the one that the psychologist, for all her care, had not prepped. Am I still allowed to call you Dad? I had to leave the room. I made it to the hallway, one hand flat on the wall, one hand over my mouth, and I stood there for the length of time it takes a 7-year-old to start to worry, which is not long. Then I came back in, and I sat down on the carpet, and I answered him. And then we went to the batting cages, because the batting cages were the plan, and 7-year-olds hold you to the plan. And he went 4 for 10 on the slow machine, and told the kid in the next cage that his dad used to play, which is barely true, and I stood there behind the netting watching him swing with his tongue out the way he does, and let him call me what I am. The registry keeps a running tally now. The consolidated case grew the way these cases grow. A news story, then a quiet intake form on the attorney's website, then people in 3 states swabbing their cheeks at monitored facilities and waiting their own 3 weeks in their own trucks and kitchens and parking lots. I have met 2 of the others so far. A pharmacist from upstate, 4 years older than me, who laughed at something the attorney said during a conference call and stopped my heart because it was my laugh, the exact one, pitch and length, coming out of a stranger's face. And a retired school teacher, born in 1980, conceived in the same office as me, 11 months earlier, who held my mother's pressed flat intake form like it was made of ash and said her parents had paid the same $1,200. There is a private group. There is a spreadsheet with a tab nobody opens twice. There are people in it who have decided not to know, and I have learned to believe that is also an answer. The founder is 82 now. The medical board cannot touch a license he surrendered 15 years ago. The criminal statutes were written too late and do not reach backward, and so the civil case is the only door there is, and the attorney is taking it off its hinges, deposition by deposition, box by box. His statement from that conference room, "I see my children, they should be grateful they exist," sits in a transcript now with a page number where it will outlive him. The 2 envelopes from the lab live in the fire safe in our den. On top of the folder from the filing cabinet, the consent forms, the invoice, the brochure with the sleeping stock photo newborn. Some nights I still open the safe and look at them, the way you press a bruise to confirm the week was real. The class action has 94 confirmed matches so far. Siblings I have never met, spread across 3 states, most of them finding out the way I did. A strange result, a quiet phone call, a line on a report that should not exist. My son is number 95.